This is Chapters from Out of the Best Books, where we hope to offer up new insights for the curious believer in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Sarah Collins, and I think that we're all riding a high after the Book of Mormon being the focus of our Come Follow Me study this year. And so you're going to love a new book by Tad R. Callister, and it will be a capstone to your reading. It's called A Case for the Book of Mormon. In this book, you'll hear compelling evidence, both physical and spiritual, for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Now, as many of us know, the critics always have something to say about the Book of Mormon. And what I love about this book is that it does not shy away from approaching those topics. In fact, reading this book will deepen your spiritual roots and your testimony of the Book of Mormon. I want you to hear part of Chapter 2 called Man-Made or God-Given, because you'll hear one of the critics' most common arguments that the Book of Mormon is man-made. Brother Callister addresses this common argument and includes witnesses against that argument, especially through the testimony of Emma Smith that I know you'll be thinking about for days. Here's Chapter 2.
The prophet Joseph Smith declared that the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion, and a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. Because the Book of Mormon is the keystone of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it has become the focal point of attack by many of the Church's critics. On one hand, if the critics can prove that the Book of Mormon is man-made, then by implication the Church is also man-made. On the other hand, if the Book of Mormon is God-given, then Joseph Smith was a prophet. And if he was a prophet, that gives credence to the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is of divine origin. Once we have a foundational testimony of the Book of Mormon as confirmed by the Spirit, then any question or challenge we confront in life, however difficult it may seem, can be approached with faith, not doubt. Why? Because the keystone of our religion, the Book of Mormon and its witness of Jesus Christ, has also become the keystone of our testimony, holding our testimony securely in place. Thus, there exists an unrelenting attack by many critics to disprove the Book of Mormon in hopes of disproving the Church and undermining faith and testimonies. That is essentially what Joseph Smith acknowledged, quote, "Take away the Book of Mormon and the Revelations, and where is our religion? We have none." End of quote. But this effort to disprove the Book of Mormon is no easy task. In fact, it is impossible, because the Book of Mormon is true. At least 11 witnesses, in addition to Joseph Smith, saw the golden plates. External and internal evidences of the book's veracity are continually emerging. Millions of believers have testified of its truthfulness. And most important, the book is readily available for one's personal examination and testing. In the end, critics must either accept Joseph Smith's account, namely, that he translated it by the gift and power of God, or produce a viable alternative. What then are those alternative explanations presented by the critics for the origin of the Book of Mormon, and what is the truth about its origin? Argument 1. Joseph Smith, an ignorant man, wrote the Book of Mormon. In 1831, a clergyman named Alexander Campbell proposed that Joseph Smith wrote rather than translated the Book of Mormon. He said, quote, "There never was a book more evidently written by one set of fingers, nor more certainly conceived in one cranium, than this same book. I cannot doubt for a single moment that he, Joseph Smith, is the sole author and proprietor of it." End quote. He also declared that Joseph Smith was, quote, "as ignorant and impudent a knave as ever wrote a book," end quote. But this assertion that someone who was ignorant and uneducated could write such a book as the Book of Mormon seemed so preposterous to other contemporary critics that they readily dismissed it, and instead presented alternative theories for the book's origin, as discussed hereafter. Even Campbell, who proposed this theory, later abandoned it in favor of another alternative. And so, the early theories about the origin of the Book of Mormon focused on the premise that Joseph Smith An unlearned man was simply incapable of writing such a complex book. After all, he was but 23 years of age, a simple plowboy from western New York who had little formal education. Consequently, the early critics concluded there must be some other explanation for the origin of the Book of Mormon than the unlikely possibility that Joseph wrote it. Argument 2. Someone else wrote it. Since Joseph Smith seemed unqualified to write the Book of Mormon, some critics proposed the theory that Joseph Smith conspired with someone who had the education, intelligence, and skills to do so. In this regard, Fawn Brodie, an avid critic of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, who wrote in the mid-1900s, observed, quote, "Unwilling to credit Joseph Smith with either learning or talent, detractors of the Mormons within a few years declared that the Book of Mormon must have been written by someone else," end quote. Following are some of those alleged authors. Oliver Cowdery. One candidate for its authorship was Oliver Cowdery, who was Joseph Smith's principal scribe during the Book of Mormon translation. After all, he was better educated than Joseph Smith. He was a school teacher and would later become a lawyer. Nonetheless, there was a major problem with this theory. Oliver never claimed to have authored any portion of the book. In fact, he testified to the contrary. He wrote, quote, "I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith, as he translated it by the gift and power of God. That book is true," end quote. We also have the historical account of Oliver attempting to translate a portion of the Book of Mormon, but failing in this effort. If Oliver wrote the Book of Mormon, why would there be an account of his unsuccessful attempt at translation? And if Oliver wrote the book, why the testimonies of David Whitmer and Joseph's wife Emma that they were present during a portion of the translation process and saw Oliver acting as Joseph's scribe? The original transcript of the Book of Mormon reflects the handwriting of several scribes besides that of Oliver Cowdery. To claim that Oliver was the author of the portions in his handwriting would seem to imply that there were multiple authors of the Book of Mormon besides Oliver, each writing that portion that appears in his or her handwriting. But if this is the case, why did none of these other scribes ever claim authorship or disclose the alleged fraud? In addition, Oliver was one of the 3 witnesses who bore testimony that an angel of God came down from heaven and showed him the golden plates from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. The 2 other witnesses made it clear that Oliver was a fellow witness with them, not the author of the book. If Oliver wrote the Book of Mormon, then one must ask, what was his motive? He received no fame, no money, no lasting power for writing the book and for remaining silent about its true authorship. In fact, 8 years after the Book of Mormon was published, Oliver was excommunicated from the church. If there were ever a time to expose Joseph Smith as a fraud, that was it. His chance to get even and to declare who the true author was. But none of that happened. To the contrary, even though it was some years before Oliver returned to the church, he always remained true to his testimony of the golden plates and the angelic manifestation, even until his death. For these and other reasons, the argument that Oliver Cowdery wrote the Book of Mormon receives little credence today. Sidney Rigdon. Another candidate for authorship of the Book of Mormon was Sidney Rigdon. As a Protestant minister, orator, and theologian, he seemed to critics to be a likely possibility. The supreme irony of this argument, however, is that Sidney Rigdon was converted by the very book he was supposed to have written. Parley P. Pratt, a former member of Rigdon's congregation, introduced him to the Book of Mormon in October 1830, about 6 months after the Book of Mormon was published. Do we have any witnesses that this is how Sidney Rigdon was converted? We do. In fact, the historical evidence is compelling. First, Parley P. Pratt recorded Rigdon's initial reaction to the Book of Mormon. Quote, "He was much surprised and it was with much persuasion and argument that he was prevailed on to read it. And after he read it, he had a great struggle of mind before he fully believed and embraced it." End quote. Second, Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy Rigdon Ellis, was 7 years old when Parley P. Pratt and Oliver Cowdery presented her father with a copy of the Book of Mormon in their home. She said she recalled the event because of the conflict that arose. Quote, "I saw them hand my father the book, and I am as positive as can be that he never saw it before. He read it and examined it for about an hour, and then threw it down and said he did not believe a word in it." End quote. Soon afterward, however, he did accept the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, joined the church, and became one of its leaders. Third, Rigdon's son John spoke to his father after visiting Utah in 1863 to study the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He asked his father to tell him the truth about the Book of Mormon, saying, quote, "You owe it to me and to our family." End quote. In other words, please don't perpetrate a fraud on your own family. John then recounted his father's response. Quote, "My father looked at me a moment, raised his hand above his head, and slowly said with tears glistening in his eyes, 'My son, I can swear before high heaven that what I have told you about the origin of that book is true." End quote. After this tender moment, John said, quote, "I believed him." End quote. Later, John joined the church. Fourth, Joseph's wife Emma declared that, quote, "No acquaintance was formed between Sidney Rigdon and the Smith family till after the church was organized, which, of course, was after the Book of Mormon had already been published." Fifth, Phineas, Heil, and Mary D. Bronson, members of the church, made the following corroborating statement, quote, "We whose signatures are affixed did hear Elder Sidney Rigdon, in the presence of a large congregation, say he had been informed that some in the neighborhood had accused him of being the instigator of the Book of Mormon. Standing in the doorway, there being many standing in the dooryard, he, holding up the Book of Mormon, said, 'I testify in the presence of this congregation and before God and all the holy angels up yonder, before whom I expect to give account at the judgment day, that I never saw a sentence of the Book of Mormon. I never penned a sentence of the Book of Mormon. I never knew there was such a book in existence as the Book of Mormon until it was presented to me by Parley P. Pratt in the form that it now is." End quote. And thus, another argument fell by the wayside. Argument 3. The Book of Mormon was plagiarized from or heavily influenced by other books. Other critics have offered a different line of attack, namely that Joseph Smith or others plagiarized or were at least heavily influenced by the historical content found in other books existing at the time. This assertion is purported to have occurred in two primary ways. One, by borrowing concepts from existing books, and two, by lifting exact or nearly exact language from such books. The Spalding Manuscript. One such theory alleged that Joseph Smith conspired with Sidney Rigdon to create the historical setting of the Book of Mormon from an unpublished manuscript written about 1812 by a man named Solomon Spalding, who had once been a Protestant minister. This document, known as the Spalding Manuscript, is a fictional account of ancient Romans who were sailing for England but were blown off course and landed in North America. As rumors spread about similarities between the Spalding Manuscript and the Book of Mormon, two critics of the church, Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, a former member of the church who had been excommunicated for immoral behavior while on a mission, and Eber D. Howe, obtained the unpublished manuscript from Spalding's widow with the intent to print it and expose the Book of Mormon as a fraud. To their great disappointment, however, they could not find the similarities for which they had hoped. Hurlbut admitted, quote, "I obtained a manuscript which was reported to be the foundation of the Book of Mormon. Upon examination, I found it to contain nothing of the kind, but being a manuscript upon an entirely different subject." End quote. To hide the embarrassment, Howe speculated that there was a second manuscript that was the real source of the Book of Mormon. But this manuscript was allegedly lost, and therefore conveniently could not be compared to see if plagiarism had occurred. Other than hearsay, there is no evidence that a second manuscript ever existed. Eventually, the first and only known manuscript was found in 1844 by L. Rice, who many years earlier had purchased the office and supplies of the aforementioned critic Eber Howe. He discovered the alleged smoking gun among the personal papers of Mr. Howe, who had previously claimed the manuscript to be missing. Knowing of its purported connection to the Book of Mormon, Mr. Rice, James Fairchild, who was then president of Oberlin College, and others, none of whom were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, reviewed the Spalding manuscript and concluded, quote, "We compared it with the Book of Mormon and could detect no resemblance between the two, in general or in detail," end quote. No wonder Sidney Rigdon, who was falsely alleged by some to have used the Spalding manuscript to write the Book of Mormon, called this theory, quote, "a moonshine story, the most base of lies, without even the shadow of truth," end quote. David Whitmer confirmed the foregoing historical facts in an interview with Joseph Smith III, the son of Joseph Smith, Jr., the prophet. Quote, "He, David Whitmer, states that Elder Sidney Rigdon was not known to the elders of the church until long after the Book of Mormon was issued, and that of his knowledge, Elder Rigdon had nothing to do with the manuscript of the Book of Mormon. That he, David Whitmer, was familiar with Joseph Smith, the methods of translation, and the circumstances connected with it and the publishing of the book, and from this acquaintance knows that the Spalding manuscript story is false and without a shadow of truth in it." End quote. With the passage of time, even various critics of the Book of Mormon have acknowledged the massive holes in this theory. For example, one such critic, Isaac Woodbridge Riley, wrote, quote, "The commonly accepted Spalding theory is insoluble from external evidence and disproved by internal evidence," end quote. When I was in my 20s, I saw a notice from the church history department stating that a copy of the Spalding manuscript could be purchased for $1. I ordered a copy and likewise found no meaningful resemblance whatsoever between the two books. In spite of the foregoing, a few critics continue to beat this dead horse theory, hoping it will run, even though it has not had a heartbeat for over a century. View of the Hebrews. With the demise of the Spalding manuscript theory, critics alleged that a principal source for the Book of Mormon was another book, View of the Hebrews, written in 1823 by Ethan Smith, no relation to the prophet Joseph Smith, and revised in 1825. This book was an attempt to prove that Native Americans were descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Because some of its themes have some similarities to themes in the Book of Mormon, critics have claimed that View of the Hebrews provided the basic framework for the Book of Mormon. However, one of the chief proponents of this argument, Fawn Brody, acknowledged obvious differences between the two books. Quote, "Thus, where View of the Hebrews was just bad scholarship, the Book of Mormon was highly original and imaginative fiction," end quote. Evidently, Brody claims that in some mysterious, inexplicable way, Joseph Smith transformed a sow's ear, View of the Hebrews, into a silk purse, the Book of Mormon, hardly a rousing endorsement for an alleged act of plagiarism. There is a simple test to determine if the Book of Mormon was copied from or relied heavily upon View of the Hebrews. Simply compare the two books and decide for yourself. With complete academic honesty, B.H. Roberts, one of the leading scholars of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, did so in the early 1920s. His desire was to inform the First Presidency of the Church of arguments that critics might make against the Book of Mormon. In this pursuit, he listed 26 possible parallels between the two books. Critics have used these parallels to argue there must be a connection between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. Hugh Nibley, however, exposed the fallacy of the argument that if two books have some parallel themes, one must have been used to create the other. He found 35 parallels between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Mormon. In fact, he referred to them as, quote, perfectly staggering parallels, end quote. Nonetheless, the Book of Mormon cannot have been plagiarized from or influenced by the Dead Sea Scrolls, in spite of the numerous parallels, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were not discovered until more than a century after the Book of Mormon was published. And certainly no one is claiming that the Dead Sea Scrolls were copied from or influenced by the Book of Mormon. The similarities between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Mormon demonstrate that two records or books on the same subject can have parallels, even numerous parallels, without any trace whatsoever of plagiarism or influence upon one another. Then what accounts for the parallels? They exist because both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Mormon are records that refer to some similar historical and religious events, and thus common themes appear in their respective texts. So it is with View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. There are some parallels because on occasion these two books are referring to similar historical and religious events, but there is no proven connection of any reliance by one upon the other. In fact, shortly before his death, B.H. Roberts declared, quote, Ethan Smith, the man who wrote View of the Hebrews, played no part in the formation of the Book of Mormon, end quote. While View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon do address some common subjects, their primary objectives and writing styles are substantially different. For example, the Book of Mormon's principal focus is to testify of Jesus Christ, declare his doctrine, and explain how we can return to him and be saved. It is written by prophets of God. Accordingly, the historical setting is not the focus, but rather the background that gives context and emphasis to the Savior and his doctrine. The principal focus, however, for View of the Hebrews is to historically connect the Native Americans to the lost 10 tribes via archaeology, legend, and recorded histories, and to reference their prophesied gathering in the last days. In addition, View of the Hebrews is a series of independent quotes and examples meant to prove this theory. On the other hand, the Book of Mormon is a cohesive narrative, a story of families and prophets who sought and struggled to live God's Word. The primary purpose, style, and tone of these two books differ significantly. Perhaps the foregoing are some of the reasons that none of Joseph Smith's contemporaries ever advanced the argument that View of the Hebrews was source material for the Book of Mormon. In other words, those who lived at the same time when View of the Hebrews was in prime circulation and had its widest readership never argued there was a connection between the two books. Why? Because there was no obvious connection to be made. In fact, this argument that View of the Hebrews was the framework for the Book of Mormon was not first made until 72 years after the Book of Mormon was published. If the connection was so obvious, why did it take the critics, many of whom were eagerly hunting for arguments to expose the Book of Mormon as man-made, 7 decades to discover it? As an additional historical note, in 1842, 12 years after the Book of Mormon was published, the church's newspaper, the Times and Seasons, under the editorship of Joseph Smith, referred to View of the Hebrews with seeming enthusiasm that it contains some historical information that might help confirm the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. If Joseph copied from or relied upon View of the Hebrews, why would he publicly call attention to it? Argument 4. Joseph suffered from a mental disorder. Some have advanced the argument that Joseph Smith suffered from a mental disorder that somehow endowed him with additional powers and skills that enabled him to write what he could not otherwise have written on his own. In 1931, Harry Beardsley, a Chicago journalist, wrote, quote, "The Book of Mormon is a product of a mind characterized by the symptoms of the most prevalent of mental diseases of adolescence, dementia praecox," end quote, sometimes referred to as schizophrenia. More recently, critics have postulated that Joseph suffered from childhood traumas and narcissistic personality disorder. These mental disorders are supposed to have given Joseph the incentive and drive to write the Book of Mormon, and also to serve as a source of the book's tone and tenor. There are fatal defects, however, with such arguments. First, there is no credible evidence that Joseph had any form of mental disorder. Second, there is no substantiating evidence that such physical or mental conditions magically bestow upon an untrained writer such as Joseph Smith the ability to instantly become a skilled writer. Third, the book is not characteristic of the mentally ill. Rather, it is positive and optimistic in its tone. It expresses love for God, is filled with hope, and is consistent in these themes. Even Fawn Brodie acknowledged this fact. Quote, critics who insist that Joseph Smith suffered from delusions have ignored in the Book of Mormon contrary evidence difficult to override. Its very coherence belies their claims. Its structure shows elaborate design. Its narrative is spun coherently, and it demonstrates throughout a unity of purpose. End quote. As you would expect, the arguments that Joseph Smith suffered from a mental disorder never got much traction. Argument 5. Joseph Smith was a creative genius who, shaped by his environment, wrote the Book of Mormon. Many critics today subscribe to the theory that Joseph Smith alone was able to compose the Book of Mormon because he was a creative genius. This is a 180-degree turnabout from the premise of earlier critics who claimed that Joseph was too illiterate, too ignorant to write such a work on his own. In fact, in their failed efforts to find a plausible theory for the origin of the Book of Mormon, the critics have now come full circle, back to the same argument originally made by Alexander Campbell in 1831, that Joseph Smith was the sole author of the Book of Mormon, except that now Joseph Smith is considered brilliant rather than ignorant. Fawn Brodie, perhaps the chief proponent of this argument, opined that Joseph Smith, the unschooled farm boy, was a creative genius who, fashioned by his environment and the influence of local history books and resources, personally wrote the Book of Mormon. Remarkably, Brodie wrote, quote, never having written a lore of fiction, Joseph Smith laid out for himself a task that would have given the most experienced novelist pause. But possibly, because of his inexperience, he plunged into the story, end quote. When one contemplates that assertion, it is nothing short of mind-boggling. Was it this same inexperience that helped him create hundreds of names, weave them into a complex set of events, and then thread the narrative together into a harmonious whole resplendent with profound doctrinal insights? By her very acknowledgement of Joseph's inexperience, Brodie has magnified the improbability of Joseph writing this monumental work on his own. Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, the person who knew him better than any other, confirmed this conclusion. She wrote, quote, Joseph Smith as a young man could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon, end quote. Nonetheless, many have bought into the argument that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon because they realize they have no viable alternative to embrace other than to admit that Joseph translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. In order to account for the history of the Book of Mormon, many critics claim that Joseph must have read or been conversant with View of the Hebrews, along with a staggering number of other books, including the Apocrypha, The Wonders of Nature, 1825, by Joseph Priest, The Golden Pot, a Modern Fairy Tale, 1814, by E.T.A. Hoffman, The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, 1816, by Gilbert J. Hunt, The First Book of Napoleon, 1809, by Eliakim the Scribe, Travels Through Arabia and Other Countries in the East, 1792, by Karsten Niebuhr, and other books pertaining to ancient geography and maps. In fact, one author has listed more than 150 books about the Native Americans that could have influenced Joseph Smith or his contemporaries. The suggestion that Joseph Smith researched and read a substantial number of these books or other local resources is a far cry from his mother's observation that he was, quote, less inclined to the perusal of books than any of the rest of our children, end quote. Nonetheless, the claim is made that these books, or a discussion of the same as found in newspapers or conversations, became the basis for the historical narrative in the Book of Mormon. Lewis C. Midgley, a church scholar, added this note, quote, critics of the Book of Mormon now seem forced to follow the agenda set out by Brodie. They must locate 19th century sources for all its content, and they must explain how Joseph Smith was able to locate, digest, winnow, and then fashion these materials into a coherent form, end quote. How might one counter this argument? Here is a list of questions an honest seeker of truth might raise. First, is there any concrete historical evidence proving that Joseph read any of these books before the Book of Mormon was translated, and that such books provided resource information for the Book of Mormon? No. Second, is there a single reference, just one, in Joseph's journals or letters suggesting he might have read or had conversations concerning any of these historical sources before translating the Book of Mormon? No. Third, did Emma Smith, who was married to him, ever comment that he referred to any of these books before the Book of Mormon was translated? No. Fourth, is there any evidence that Joseph visited the libraries where these books may have been located? No. Fifth, are there any independent sources who claim that Joseph discussed any of these books at any time with them before the Book of Mormon was translated? No. Sixth, is there any record that Joseph had any of these books or related notes present when he translated the Book of Mormon? No. Emma Smith was a first-hand witness of this. Asked in an interview if Joseph read from any books or notes while dictating, she replied, quote, he had neither manuscript nor book to read from. If he had had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me, end quote. In 1881, the Chicago Times reported, after an interview with David Whitmer, quote, Mr. Whitmer emphatically asserts, as did Harris and Cowdery, that while Smith was dictating the translation, he had no manuscript, notes, or other means of knowledge save the seer stone and the characters as shown on the plates, he, Whitmer, being present and cognizant how it was done, end quote. One might ask, how many no's does it take to expose the critic's argument as pure speculation? Nothing more than a sandcastle that comes crashing down when the first wave of honest questions appear on the scene? Does anyone honestly expect us to believe that Joseph Smith, an unlearned young man of 23 years of age, searched out and studied all these resources on Native American life, inhaled the related conversations on the topic, ferreted out the irrelevant, organized the remainder into an intricate story involving hundreds of characters, numerous locations, detailed war strategies, and doctrinal gems, and then dictated it with perfect recollection without any notes whatsoever, no outline, no manuscript, nothing, a fact acknowledged even among Joseph's critics? And during the entire translation process, no one remembers Joseph going to libraries, bringing any such books home, or having any conversations concerning this research? Where, we might ask, is the corroborating evidence? It is nowhere to be found. Divine authenticity. Emma Smith, speaking to her son, confirmed her belief regarding the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon and the inability of Joseph to write such a book. She wrote, quote, my belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as a scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he would at once begin where he had left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible, end quote. This may seem insignificant to some, but to me it is astounding. For 34 years as a lawyer, I regularly dictated correspondence and other documents to my secretary. As I did so, I was often interrupted by a phone call or question. After such interruptions, I would invariably ask my secretary, "Where was I?" But Joseph was not dictating or writing a new work. He was translating an ancient scriptural record by the power of God, and therefore did not need to ask, "Where was I?" An honest seeker after truth must eventually ask, if the Book of Mormon did not come forth by divine means as described by Joseph Smith, then what is the explanation for its origin? As the theories of men become exposed and eliminated from serious consideration, Joseph Smith's explanation of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon remained the only viable option on the table. And why? Because it is as true can be. In this regard, Elder Richard G. Scott offered this suggestion, quote, "Discover for yourself that the Book of Mormon, is true. As you read each page, ask, could any man have written this book, or did it come as Joseph Smith testified?" End quote. Who did write the Book of Mormon? If neither Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, or Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, then who did? It was written by ancient prophets who lived in the Americas. While there were only 4 key engravers of the golden plate, Nephi, Jacob, Mormon, and Moroni, there were many other prophet authors of the Book of Mormon, such as Mosiah, Alma, and Helaman. Do we have any evidence that the Book of Mormon was written by multiple authors, thus giving credence to the account of its origin as told by Joseph Smith? We do. A form of statistical analysis called stylometrics can help discover the identity of unknown or disputed authors. Some stylometric studies have been conducted on the Book of Mormon to determine who its true author or authors might have been. Because stylometrics is an emerging science that is being refined over time, these studies have resulted in various outcomes, but certain common elements have appeared when proper methodologies have been applied. In analyzing these studies, 3 scholars in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who have expertise in this field, Matthew Roper, Paul J. Fields, and G. Bruce Shalje, have concluded, quote, "It should be understood that stylometry cannot prove that the Book of Mormon was written by multiple ancient American prophets. What it can reliably demonstrate, and what valid data from existing studies collectively argue, is that 1, the Book of Mormon was written in multiple distinct authorship styles. 2, these distinct styles are consistent with the authors designated within the text itself. And 3, none of the proposed 19th century authors, such as Sidney Rigdon or Solomon Spaulding, including Joseph Smith himself, have writing styles that are similar to those found in the Book of Mormon." End quote. This evidence is one more witness that Joseph Smith did not author the Book of Mormon, but rather translated it by the power of God.
I really appreciate Brother Callister using Emma's words as a particularly strong piece of evidence for the authenticity of the origin of the Book of Mormon. And the chapter continues with more amazing insights. So if you want to hear the rest of that chapter and the whole book, download Deseret Bookshelf Plus, where you can hear the entire audiobook, or pick up your own copy of A Case for the Book of Mormon today at your local Deseret Book or at DeseretBook.com. We'll see you next week on Out of the Best Books.